in Medina around 745. And then Hassan's final residence in Iraq, that's when the critiques of his memory are raised. Okay, this is at least a decade before that. Okay, so Bukhari's chain runs through the early pupil of Uyayna. Then we can go here.
So Hisham was in Medina, but Sufyan was in Mecca.
Yeah, but here's the...
Unless Hisham visited Mecca, which is possible. It's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible.
No, but both of them, we know they were both in Mecca and Medina throughout that period. They were visiting back and forth all the time.
Hisham was in Medina and Sufyan was based in Mecca. And it's possible they met.
No, he was studying. No, you can just ask, did he start studying in 745 with Urwa? Because basically, the first Meccan studies that happened were during Hajj seasons. Okay?
So it's saying that it's possible that Sufyan heard it from Hisham during his Hajj trips or when Sufyan traveled to Medina. So it's saying the possibility is there that if he definitely heard it from Hisham and it was not made up, then he would have heard it during a visit from either to the other's city.
I just want you to ask this question, okay? What evidence do we have of Sufyan studying with Urwa? Have you gotten an answer yet?
Yeah, I'm good. Just back in. So summary, while there is no single detailed report explicitly saying Sufyan studied under Hisham at this specific moment, strong evidence comes from the combination of his direct narrations, biographical reports, and scholarly endorsements. Thus, Sufyan ibn Anas' connection with Hisham ibn Urwa is firmly established, through these indirect and direct historical sources. That's the summary.
What was the question you asked?
The question that you asked me to ask. What evidence?
Yeah, wait, no, so you just read what you wrote. Wait, no, can you read what you wrote?
Yeah, what evidence do we have of Sufyan studying with Urwa?
And then, okay, now read the answer that you just read.
Okay. You want me to read the summary again?
You can read the summary if you want. Or if you just read the answer starting from the beginning, that would be the most helpful.
Great question. Direct and indirect evidence. Sufyan ibn Uyayna studied under Hisham ibn Urwa. Direct evidence, chain of transmission and hadith collections. So Sufyan is directly linked to Hisham in hadith chains. Sufyan narrates from Hisham in these chains, which implies a teacher-student relationship. The classical hadith collections such as Bukhari and Muslim, Sufyan is listed as one of the narrators of hadith transmitted from Hisham bin Urwa. So he's just using the same hadith, such as the age of Aisha, to imply a teacher-student relationship.
Okay, here's what I'm
Narrates
doing.
from Hisham.
Because we keep getting completely different, responses in a way that's bizarre. I'm getting biographers state explicitly that Sufyan's lessons came in Medina. So this is what I'm getting. His Sufyan's lessons from Hisham happened in Mecca, Medina, phrase quoted in manuals. I copied hadith from Hisham while I was in Mecca. So it's attributing the quote directly to Sufyan. And then there's no record of him traveling to Iraq. Historians list the few places Sufyan visited. Yemen once, Egypt once, Iraq is never named. His own students note Iraqis came to him in Hajj. So here's the reconstruction. Okay, and I'm just going to use the age Arabic years. Okay, so 125 to 130. Teenage Sufyan attends Hissam's circle in Medina while on study trips from Mecca. 145 to 146. Old Hissam finally settles in Kufa, Baghdad. Memory begins to slip. 160 to 170. Adult Sufyan teaches Aisha report to student Yusuf during Hajj sessions. 198 to 814 CE. Sufyan dies in Mecca, having never relocated to Iraq.
Yeah, so it says in the summary, there is no single detailed report explicitly stating Sufyan studied under Hisham at this specific moment in time. The strong evidence comes from the combination of his direct narrations, biographical reports, and scholarly endorsements. Why are you disputing that?
I just told you. So, I mean, I was just reading for you what I'm reading. I just read everything I said just straight off the page.
Islamophobe, he read you something saying that he claimed to have copied hadith directly from him in Medina. Right? That's why he's saying that.
I thought he was trying to brag about the fact that he could read.
Maybe you could just recap it. The reason that we've gone down this rabbit hole is because he's claiming that the information was from this senile guy that directly was wrong, but you've shown him that the information that came from the chain was reliable, right? That's what you've been basically.
Right, I mean, just so we can zoom out to a really big picture here, because we have gotten in the weeds, which is the big picture detail here is we have this in Bukhari and Muslim through multiple independent chains, some of which don't go through Urwa at all. Okay? Now, in the Bukhari chain, okay, Urwa is a key link in the chain, but we have multiple independent chains, so not all the chains have to run through Urwa. Now, there are critiques of Urwa's reliability. Okay? The critique of Urwa's reliability is that after he was 75 years old, basically that his memory started to decline. Now, an important thing to keep in mind here is no one ever accused him of getting confused. No one thought he was senile. No one thought he had fabricated anything. Just that his recollection was getting less sharp, right? And that basically there were things that he was forgetting that he had previously known, so his memory wasn't as strong. But not that he was confused or that he was like misrecollecting verses. But still, the commentators put a caveat where they weren't going to trust Urwa from that Iraq period because there were just questions about it, so it couldn't be strong and be included in collections like Bukhari from the Iraq period. So the commentators specifically were selecting for the Urwa stuff that's from his Medina period. Then we go and we say, okay, we actually have recorded in Bukhari the next guy that he passed it on to, which is the Zuyaina. Then we can look at when those guys would have interacted and when we know they did interact. And we know they interacted in the Medina period, basically, rather than during the late Iraq Kufa period. And so all the evidence that we're seeing is pointing to basically when this guy's memory is being praised, it's around that time that he's transmitting this basically hadith.
The question you have to ask yourself is, what did Bukhari know and when did he know?
Because are you feeling lucky, Punk?
Is this all to serve the greater, the whole, like, whether or not they could be trusted as sources?
Right, because what we're talking about right now is Bukhari is like 200 years after the events. But Bukhari tells us all his sources. Okay? So we can retrace when these sayings would come from and who they're coming from. And so the claim is that along multiple independent lines of transmission like this, from people who are just attested, because Bukhari, the reason why Bukhari is held in such high regard, the reason why he's saying there are people that hold it higher than the Quran, is because Bukhari was so good about only using the best sources and documenting who his sources were. And so that compilation, the compilation in Bukhari, basically, this is stuff that's really, really good. Because basically, like, the reason why people like Urwa is because all of the guys that were meeting Urwa were like, wow, this guy's a memorization genius. He basically has a photographic memory. And so we have that, but for multiple different lines. So there's not one single point of failure. Getting this verse back to literally Aisha's nephew.
Right.
And then
what essentially Longprobe is trying to do is he's trying to say, but at some point he got like dementia, and that's when he said that she was 9. Right, that's like his claim.
Right, but the entire reason
gone back and shown him that it's not that it's
right, because the entire reason
was transmitted before he was even if you said he had dementia, it was transmitted before because there's chains that go back and you can see the chain.
And the other thing we can do is we can see from these chains of transmission, we can see, first of all, obviously we can see that this was during the Medina period. But the second thing is that we know that Bukhari knew about these concerns that were raised about Urwa. And Bukhari, his entire thing is Hadith criticism. That's the whole point of this compilation. So Bukhari, the compilation, is based off of really high standards for Hadith criticism. And everybody knew the criticisms of Urwa from his Iraq period. Which is why just even the inclusion in the text shows you that you have attestation from the Medina period.
I think you should become a Salafist advocate because you're presenting the Salafist position on Hadith criticism. Like I said, you're overemphasizing Bukhari's reliability and becoming an advocate for Salafi Islam. Like I said, there's a Hadith
the opposite made about you, right? You're merely saying that Bukhari, when I don't like what he has to say, I think he's unreliable, right? For some unknown reason.
I don't like Bukhari. I think he's unreliable. No, those are not my words. That's the words you put it into mine.
No, I think that's what's been implied. I don't think you said it. I think that's what's been implied.
On the main, I accept a lot from Bukhari. A lot. But there are some which are problematic. And I mentioned one problematic one previously. The hadith which says, kill whoever changes his religion. And my first point of criticism is that the Quran does not support that. The Quran talks about apostasy and does not prescribe a punishment for it. Secondly, the Prophet is never known to have killed anyone for simple apostasy. Thirdly, the hadith is problematic because it says kill whoever changes his religion. So if you, Tim, become a Muslim, if I was a hadith follower, a blind hadith follower, I would have to kill you because you have changed your religion. And that's the wording of the hadith. But Bukhari included it, even though it is absurd in its wording. It is problematic as far as...
And maybe here's the thing that we could conclude. Maybe the Prophet said something ineloquent.
Kill whoever... No. We will not say he said something here.
No, but we will say that as the atheists that are just going based on the historical sources. The atheist,
kill whoever changes his religion
the Christian,
is so problematic.
The atheist, the Christian, the critical historian, okay, the Jew, okay, everybody, the Hindu, when we're looking at it, right, when I, the Christian, am looking at it, I'm going to approach it from the perspective of what does the historical evidence tell me, not from the presupposition, well, if Muhammad said it, it must have been perfectly eloquent.
The other thing too is like when you're saying you accept some of the things that Bukhari says so what Ethan has been attempting to do for the last 45 minutes is to show you that your idea that the reason that that it's not true that he had sex with a 9-year-old because this guy was senile by the time that was transmitted. He's given you reasonable evidence to show that information was transmitted before he could have been senile, right? And so it would lower your reasons to believe that particular hadith is not sahih, right? Or not sahih. It would make it so it is sahih, right? So you can't just arbitrarily decide to not accept Bukhari for unknown reasons, right? If you have a decent reason to believe that it's true, then you ought to believe it, because you said that you do accept his hadiths, provided there's good reason to believe them.
No, what I said was it's not based on this, that, or the other reason, unknown reasons. I specified my reasoning. My reasoning is that in my faith, the Quran is first. The Quran comes first and foremost. It is the word of God. Bukhari is not God. His word is not the word of God. So it's not even the word of the Prophet. It's a report coming, going down the chain over 200 to 300 years, depending upon which book it is, when he wrote it. There are reasons for that, questioning Bukhari as a Muslim, but not questioning the Quran. So I presented that for both these examples that I've given. For the age of Aisha, I presented my reasoning. It's not unknown reasoning as you falsely alleged it. I presented my reasoning very succinctly that the Quran comes first because as a Muslim, I believe it is the word of God. It is reliable. It is trustworthy. It is precise in its language. It does not lack in eloquence. The hadith in some cases has problems. And if the Quran does not support the hadith, however much the Salafist or the Christian anti-Islamic apologist or polemicist might want it to be, if it does not tally
well, where does this say silent? The Quran doesn't say anything is silent, right? The Quran is silent about whether he had sex with a 9-year-old, right? We don't have anything in the Quran that says he did or he didn't, right? So to say something like the Quran doesn't agree with the Quran is not possible, because it doesn't report him having sex with Aisha. That's an outside report, right? So to say, well, I can't believe this because it's not in the Quran, it's like saying, well, we didn't have a report that the sun was going to came up last Tuesday at 9 a.m., so therefore it didn't happen, right? You're just making basically an argument from silence if you're talking about the Quran.
Okay, I was having a discourse with Ethan, and my argument perhaps...
Please stop. You can fold it like a cheap chair, okay? It's over. Just stop. Stop wasting Ethan's time with your nonsense, please.
Okay, end the discussion because you think that...
Look, ChatGPT 3 has not done you well, okay? He just gave you a ridiculous amount of his time. It's boring, it's over. You can fold it like a cheap chair.
Well,
Game over. Bye-bye.
Islam, you do now concede that the chain of narration, which you called into question, you did so erroneously. Do you concede that much at least?
No, I said most of them are from Iraqi narrators. Most of them. I didn't say all of them were. So my point still stands. In most cases, they are. But to answer to Tim, if you don't mind,
no, that's a lot.
But Bukhari 5133 that we just said, that's one of the main ones, right? And we just saw that it went through Urwa in the Medina period.
Again, you're not letting me speak. Let me respond to Tim first, and I'll come to Ethan. So Tim, first of all, you said the Quran is silent on the age of the Prophet's marriage to Aisha on her age. It does not directly mention it, but we have reasons, strong reason, to show that marriage is with a woman, an adult female, not a prepubescent girl. So there's strong reasoning for that. I've presented you the fact that whenever the Quran talks about marriage and divorce, it uses the word woman, not female in general. And that applies to 65:4, which is a verse under contention within the Muslim world and also outside. take the scholars more or less blindly and say, look, they say it refers to young girls, so it must be referring to young girls. No, the Quran is not silent in that sense. It is talking about marriage with women, not with females in general. So that, I suppose, answers Tim's point. Now back to the Urwa, Hisham bin Urwa, which Ethan took the pains to ask ChatGPT and maybe consult muslimscholars.net or whatever site you refer to, Ethan. They are Salafist scholars, and they will highlight whatever, there's a battle within the Muslim world as regards these hadith, and they're highlighting certain things, and the opposite group is highlighting the other things or some other things. So there is a debate within the Muslim world on this as regards the authenticity of that narrations. And the Iraqi transmission, or most of them being from Iraq, is a point that I mentioned. You have highlighted those few, or perhaps one, or maybe one or two others, maybe more even, where there is no issue with the Iraqi transmission. And that doesn't mean that these hadiths are necessarily correct. Like, we're talking about over 2 centuries afterwards. So, for me, the Quran is first and foremost. I apply it in other aspects of Islamic jurisprudence, including apostasy, which is an example that I gave to illustrate the point. Now, if you want to tag along with the Salafists or those who think alike, you're welcome to do that, but it won't affect me, because for me the Quran is first and foremost.
Okay, but just we've been through this so many times, but okay. So obviously all the stuff that you said to Tim, well, we've had a whole conversation about that, where we're showing you disagree with all the classical lexicons, you disagree with all the tafsir, you're imposing what you take the word to mean after literally like more than a millennia of semantic drift. You're taking that over the consensus of the early interpreters of it, including and what the lexicographers would say based on the standards that they use, which is also consistent with the same evidential standards that you're applying to evaluate the reliability of Bukhari. Because then we're going here to the Bukhari stuff, and there is no evidence that these verses, that Bukhari was credulous of Urwa during the Iraq period. I just don't see any evidence of Bukhari being credulous of Urwa, not cognizant of the criticisms of Urwa during the Iraq period. I mean, the criticisms that are made of him during the Iraq period, even if they were true, and even if it were from the Iraq period, they would not prove your case. They would just be slight evidence in favor of your case. And the nature of the criticisms is way different than the nature of the error he would have to be committing to get this wrong. Okay? And it would be totally disconfirmed by multiple independent attestation through other lines. And so Urwa he's not an indispensable link in the chain. But the thing that makes this crazy, that we've spent so much time talking about it, is that Urwa was in Medina when he reported it. Okay? That's the crazy thing, is it's not during the Iraq period. It's during the period when his memory was strongest. And so that I just don't know how many times we can keep saying that. But this isn't just based off of the biased sources. There's no evidence that you could give of Hassam in Kufa or Baghdad, okay, before Urwa's death.
Sorry, no evidence that Hisham was in Kufa or Baghdad or Iraq
before Urwa's death.
So you reckon he died in Medina? So what you reckon?
No, Urwa was in Iraq. And Hassam,
right,
you can try to say that there's a documented move of his to Baghdad, right? But you have to consider these two things.
So
the Urwa.
Again, okay, go on.
No, sir, I'm just trying to. So we're trying to pin down when would this connection have to have happened, the Urwa to Hassam connection. Now we know for a fact that he was recording and reporting hadith when they met up during the Medina period. Now you're trying to claim that, well, it's possible they met up again during his Iraq period, and he was actually reporting a verse from the Iraq period when they surreptitiously, unbeknownst to the historians or any evidence, met up in Iraq. Now I'm asking for the evidence that these two ever met in Iraq.
Again, you sound, if you ever become a Muslim, it seems you would be a Salafist who diehard looks at the Hadith and then forgets about the Quran.
What?
Or interprets rather the Quran in the light of the Hadith. Hold on, let me finish. I don't interrupt people. I expect the same sort of things. When I finish, you're welcome to speak. So, with regards to the Quran, again, you talked about the tafsir scholars, the commentators, and said that effectively that I'm ignoring them. I don't ignore the word of Allah. The word of Allah to me is clear on this matter. It's very clearly talking about adult females. There is a word for females in general in Arabic, and the Quran uses that word. When it comes to marriage and divorce, it does not use that word. It uses adult females, women, nisa. So for me, the issue is very clear that as far as the Quran is concerned, marriage is with adult females for men. It is with adult females, not with females in general, of any age, young or old. It's about those who are adult. Okay, so for me, that is the decisive, as far as my religion is concerned, that is decisive. There can be a lot of noise about hadiths, and there is, especially from circles who either are diehard hadith supporters and advocate the hadith being at par with the Quran, or even in some cases above it. And those who want to attack Islam will jump on that and use these fallible human sources to discredit Islam. That's fine. That's your job in a way. But as far as my faith is concerned, it is in the Quran and in the words of Allah, not commentaries which go against the word of Allah. So I'm clear on this. Marriage and divorce, you can check verse after verse. Do a search for marriage verses. Ask what nisa means in these verses. You will find that they're talking about adult females. So for me, the matter is decisive. I do not accept those hadiths on the age of Aisha because they are contrary to the Quran. That's my starting point. The rest of the analysis, okay, let's engage in a discussion on it. If you really want to have a discussion.
This is the Muslim equivalent of Protestantism. Like, this is Protestant level exegesis. Where it's outside of the. So, first is we're completely going against all the lexicographic evidence we would have about the meaning of the verse. It wouldn't even be a logical implication of the verse that what happened was impossible. So, we're going against all the authoritative commentaries on it based on the best evidence we have about what it meant. Even if you were right, it wouldn't imply that these events hadn't happened. And we're using that to dismiss lots of multiply attested independent lines of transmission with a lot of source transparency, with reliable sources, okay, that directly attest to the events specifically, and that satisfy all the historical criteria that we would use. This is literally Islamic Protestantism.
Well, it does seem interesting, though, because it seems like you could be equivocating on what you mean by adult female, right? Like, because I would just take that, if you look at, like, sort of jurisprudence within the Islamic world, that just means all you had to do was menstruate, right? But you could menstruate at 9 and not be an adult, right? It's not a sufficient condition to menstruate, and therefore you're a woman. But if you're taking it something like, well, let's say she menstruated, so she's therefore a woman, right? That would just be like a weird way to put that, because nobody thinks that just because you menstruate that therefore you're a woman and you're capable of having sex and being married, right? But if that's what you're going to say, that's what the Quran is saying. We just have to be having a new dispute.
Tim, why are you saying
okay, so Ethan appealed to Lane's lexicon, and I asked ChatGPT again, what does Lane's lexicon say nisa means? And the summary is, according to Lane's lexicon, nisa means women in the general sense, typically referring to adult females, though it can also imply wives, depending on the context. So it's again referring to adult females.
But that's not what it's referring. You literally just read typically, which means it's in the semantic range. And then you just showed by reading of it, which is it refers to the social
girl, do you take it that if a female menstruates, that she's now considered an adult?
A woman may not menstruate, an adult female may not menstruate, and that's one of the conditions mentioned in 65.4, where a woman does not menstruate.
What's the waiting period if they don't menstruate? 3 months, right?
Why is everyone saying that word so fucking weird?
What are you talking about?
Menstruate? It's not menstruate.
Okay, Jesus. What I'm asking you, I'm just asking you, what do you, in your world, if a female menstruates, is that a sufficient condition to call her ready for marriage and ready for sex?
So the Quran talks about two things. It talks about readiness for
Can you say yes or no and then answer? Can you say yes or no and then answer?
No, because it's a nuanced answer. I want to give what the Quran states on this.
Right, yeah, you can say what the Quran states, but just in general,
Please don't interrupt.
I asked you a question because
I did not specify how you ask the question. Why you specify?
I'm asking it.
How I answer the question.
No, I'm clarifying. I'm just asking you, can you firm positive yes or no, and then you can get as long as an answer as you want to clarify what it means. But is simply having menstruated a sufficient condition to get married within your religion? Yes or no, and then you can say yes, why?
Not according to the Quran, which is what I was trying to explain. According to the Quran, a woman must reach the age of marriage, which is understood to be puberty, and on top of that, she must have mental aptitude. That's what the Quran stipulates in chapter 4, verse 6.
Let's get the verse that says you have to be reach puberty. What verse do you want us to look at?
We just have to reaching puberty would be like that just means like is that at the beginning of puberty?
No. Let's just take you at face value. Like, okay, tell us your verse to prove that it has to be puberty.
Chapter 4, verse 6. Apart from the word nisa, self-indicating adulthood.
Oh wait, so you're just going based on your Nasa reading?
No.
What is the evidence that the marriageable age is puberty that's in the text?
Nikah indicates ability to copulate. So it's talking about.
That's talking about the sex age.
Yeah, say that.
So what evidence do you have? Because our allegation is that Muhammad slept with Aisha before she had puberty. So it's just question begging to say that.
Okay, so let me take it from the standard or the common Sunni position. I'm not a Sunni, I'm an Ahmadi. From the common Sunni position or the Salafist position, those who uphold the Hadith, she was 6, and the reason the delay 3 years took place was because she was not yet post-pubescent. She had not yet reached marriageable age. So let me start from the Sunni perspective and show to you that actually your argument is flawed from the Hadith.
Okay, well, no, now we can argue from a different perspective. So if you'll grant us the ages, now we can argue about the puberty. Okay. So the first thing we can do is we can look at what are the first mentions we have of Aisha menstruating. Okay. Now, basically, in going by Arabic years, we have it in about 10. Okay, 10 age. Okay. So then, and basically, it could be, maybe you could read it as 6. Okay, so 6 to 10. So at least 4 years after the marriage, as many as 9 years after the marriage, that was when Aisha started weeping because she just started to menstruate on the journey. Okay? There's no hadith at all that has an earlier menstrual period. All of them are subsequent to the one in Surif. Okay? Then we have playing with dolls. So we know she continued to play with dolls when Muhammad was there after they started moving together. not yet reached puberty. So that legal rationale means she's being treated as a minor who hadn't reached puberty. Then just like, if we thought about it from just plausibility, not working within the Islamic perspective, basically the average age of menstruation is going to be 13 years of age. Under 10 years is a very long tail. That's an extremely precocious puberty. Okay. So, I mean, statistically, when you have bad nutrition, which you would have had at the time, that would delay rather than accelerate the puberty. So we have the first mention of her having menstruation that's like 5 years after the wedding, being charitable. We have evidence that she had the legal status that a prepubescent girl would have, even after they had consummated the marriage. And we just have the prior plausibility that she would have extremely precocious puberty in a malnourished environment.
Okay, so can you provide evidence that dolls were forbidden to girls post-puberty, and under which law? Was it under Islamic law?
So we have it under the classical jurist. Yeah, so if you look at, so we have Al-Bari's commentary on Bukhari 6130. Okay, so we go there. So, here, I'll read it. So first is, let's get the original passage, and then we'll get the commentary on it. So, original passage. I used to play with the dolls in the presence of the Prophet, and my girlfriends also used to play with me. When Allah's messenger used to enter my dwelling place, they used to hide themselves, but the Prophet would call them to join and play with me. The playing with the dolls and similar images is forbidden, but it was allowed for Aisha at that time, as she was a little girl not yet reached the age of puberty. And that's Al-Bari, page 143, volume 13. So you have in the original, the part where it just says, that's being narrated from Aisha's perspective, from her point of view. That part is the Bukhari 6130. And then the Al-Bari, that's volume 13, page 143 for prepubescent.
So again, does Islamic law forbid women from playing with dolls?
I'm just giving you Bari's interpretation.
I think he's trying to say something like, look, the Quran doesn't say anything where you can't play with dolls, so therefore Islamic law, it's not a law of Islam or something like that. I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, Al-Bari's inference, not my inference, Al-Bari's inference is that since playing with dolls and similar images was forbidden, but it was allowed for Aisha, she must not have reached the age of puberty. So that's the classical Islamic jurist position.
But is it from the Quran or the Hadith of the Prophet that it is forbidden to play with dolls if you are post-pubescent?
See, that's
from the commentary of the jurists on the Hadith.
Yeah, so it's not a Hadith. So it's not Quran and Hadith. Which
no, it's just the inference that is drawn from the Hadith by the jurist who knew the rules.
Okay, all right, go with it.
Well, I don't know why you'd be laughing and chuckling, right? It seems like what happens is anytime a position you don't like, you just sort of like, you seem to dismiss it out of hand, but not for no good reason, right? But then when you want to, you'll stand on some point for the equally no good reason when you want to, when it seems to like, when you wanted to like bolster your point, right? So we're providing, or at least Ethan is providing you with like well-known documentation on these things, giving you tafsir, giving you hadith, giving you textual context, giving you like where this came from. And then when it doesn't agree with you, you just seem to like nervously chuckle and go, well, go with that if you want, bro. I mean, how would anybody be able to ever convince you of anything if that's how you're going to act?
Yeah, the point you misrepresented my position. My position is clear. The sources of Islamic knowledge, let me mention them in case you haven't heard me mention it before, which is probably the case. The Quran primary source of Islamic knowledge, the supreme source. Anything conflicts with the Quran, we would not accept it. The second source of Islamic knowledge is the practice, the established practice of the Prophet, the living practice, such as how to perform the Salah, the Muslim prayer. That is the second source of Islamic knowledge. How he performed the Salah, for example. The third source is the Hadith, the compilations of Hadith, of which 6 are known to be classed as authentic by scholars. But they are only accepted by us on the condition that they comply with the Quran, the living established practices of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And thirdly, they also comply with other Hadith. They should reflect with any.
Sure.
The Quran. First of all,
I can accept all that, but let's just.
I didn't interrupt you. No, please.
No, but we've heard you've actually. I've heard you say that 3 times already today, so it's not like we don't need it again, right? But you could just say that this established practice of the Prophet, right, was narrated by Bukhari through what's that guy's name? Ethan Aubrey or whatever his name was, right? They're just establishing that he had a practice, that he was with his wife Aisha and she was playing with dolls. So that would be well within your own jurisprudence acceptance of what would be something you ought to take as.
Well, you were mixing up something though. So no, it's fine. It's just the Bari is the jurist that's commentating on the Bukhari. There was a separate dispute that we had earlier about the authenticity of these Bukhari passages. And that was the whole thing that we were debating about earlier. But now we're talking about jurists that are reacting to Bukhari.
Okay, so if I may just point out that for me, it's not a case of the Prophet is reported to have done something, so therefore that is an established practice. That is just a claim that he is reported to have done this or said this or that. It's not an established practice like how the Muslims perform the prayer. That was passed down from one generation of Muslims to the next with overlap of generations. So the Salah is a good example to give of established practices of the Prophet. So this hadith, which goes against the Quran, is not an established practice. Sorry.
But it doesn't. So here's a few things. First, so we have the hadiths that are banning images and figures, and so those are in Bukhari directly, right? The 5957, that's one of the Bukharis. Okay, we have it in Muslim 2107. Okay, so we have commentaries on those from the jurist that show that if she was post-pubescent, it would contradict those strong hadith, and so that's people like Kitabi. Okay. So we have the early commentators that point out the contradiction. And then we have the people like in Bari, al-Bari, we have him resolving the contradiction with she's prepubescent.
So there's no Islamic law that says that. So, it's neither here nor there.
But we have strong hadith that say that's the law.
Which hadith says that's the law?
Okay, we have Bukhari 5957. And we have the interpretation of Bukhari 5957 by Kitabi.
That's just the same hadith about the 6 and 9.
No, that's not the same. It's the makers of these images will be punished. It's that hadith, the general hadith, that bans the images for adults. Then if you go to Kitabi, the hadith shows dolls are forbidden in principle. The exception applies because Aisha had not yet reached puberty. The exception is age limited. Once the reason childhood disappears, the ban reapplies. Okay, so that's the early commentator in Kitabi. Then we have the medieval rulings.
Okay.
What?
Go on.
What'd you say?
I said you're still grasping at straws.
It's not. These are very reputable sources within Islam that we're citing uniformly authorities, and you're going based off of your own judgment.
No, it's not my judgment. There are millions of Muslims, Ahmadi Muslims, who uphold what I'm stating. So it's our Khalifa.
No, but what's an actual historical authority that you have to support your claim?
Historical authority, the Quran is the word of God.
But it doesn't contradict the Quran. You haven't shown a contradiction with the Quran. You've presupposed that your reading of the Quran is correct. And it goes way beyond what could possibly be supported by the text, and no one ever took the text to mean that.
Again, these are just claims you're making.
Well, he's not the idea about a Quran.
Let me speak. Come on, Tim. Calm down. Come on, please. I mean, the authority that I appeal to for a start is our Khalifas, the Ahmadiyya Khalifas. And I have myself heard the commentary on 65.4, for instance, by the Ahmadiyya Khalifa, who specifies that it's referring to women. So, if there is a scholar in the past who suggested otherwise, or somebody who interpreted the hadith about idols and idol worship and pictures to apply to dolls, which are not idols, then that is his interpretation. You want me to blindly follow him because he's one scholar you can appeal to. There are thousands of scholars amongst Muslims. Their opinions are incorrect.
Okay, give me one.
Where does the Quran say?
Give me one source within 300 years of the life of the Prophet that supports your view.
Which view in particular? About idols and dolls?
Your view about the age, your view about the dolls being permissible, anything.
No, you have to establish that in Islam.
Give me your view about that it means that it excludes underage women, like any view you've supported throughout. So underage women, that the dolls were permissible for adult women, that, anything about the age of Aisha being 17. Give me within 300 years of the life of the Prophet any source.
You want me to appeal to Shiite sources who mentioned that she was about 18?
Yeah, give me if it's within 300 years of the Prophet and there's any source transparency at all, I'll be interested in it.
So I don't need to go there.
No, but if it's within 300 years of the Prophet and it has any source transparency in it at all, I will listen to it, be happy.
Why not 350 years?
Okay, if you have to go 350 years out, that's less good, but okay, fine. Give me that. That'll be good. Okay, 400 years.
Why is it less good when the Quran is the word of Allah, which we believe to be the word of Allah, which is clear enough that marriage is with adult females?
But it's not clear about that. That's why all the early commentators disagree.
For 300 years, people didn't take it to think what you think it.
So that's the definition of not clear.
The Quran is clear enough. It talks about women in that verse, for instance. It talks about reaching the age of marriage. It talks about rushd, or having acumen, with regard, mental maturity with regards to marriage. So, putting those verses together, all the verses on marriage and divorce and related matters, when it talks about adult females, that is decisive. It is not unclear. The fact
Okay,
that
if it wasn't unclear at all?
Let me finish, please.
If it wasn't unclear, how did every source mess it up?
When the Quran, when people are partially sighted or blinded by prejudice, they do not look at the facts. When people are men and they do not know about the details of women's
Yes, but I think that's you.
conditions.
So how do we adjudicate the dispute? I think you're a man who's biased by your prejudices, who's putting yourself above all the sources who have more context than you, that actually speak the language with the idiolect that it had at the time in which it was written, okay, who are going based off of strong hadith that have source transparency, where we've traced out all your criticisms of it, they've all crumbled, okay? But why is it that we should trust you? Why are you God?
I never claim to be God. I go by the word of God, which is clear enough. If people put their minds to it and people are not influenced by their prejudices, of course you want to accuse me of it, but I made a general statement. You made it specific to me. No, let me finish. Come on, I didn't interrupt you. Let me finish. Please give me the same place. The word of God, to reiterate, the word of God uses the word for adult. that is decisive enough for me. That scholars made a mess of it, or there were male scholars who didn't know about women's conditions, such as primary amenorrhea and adult females may not menstruate. If they're not aware of this, the fault lies with them. They are partially sighted, as humans tend to be. But analyzing the verses, as some scholars have done, including the leader of my group of Muslims, for me, the case is settled. I am looking at the Quran, and I'm also looking at the authorities that I adhere to, that I uphold, and they are saying it's referring to adult females. For me, the matter is clear as far as the word of God is concerned. The hadith may complain otherwise, but there are all sorts of hadith. There are
but you've just given up on.
There are sound hadith, there are weak hadith.
But if you want your argument to be persuasive, I don't care about autobiographically that because of your biases and presuppositions that what's good enough for you is to go with your own linguistic intuitions and all of your extremely late modern sources that apparently agree with you out of a desire to conform to basically the social standards that are prevailing today. I don't care about that. So if it's going to be of any dialectical force for me, I'm going to want to say, hey, okay, take one of the disputes we've had. What the meaning of this word in the Quran is. What is the semantic range of the word? Does it only apply to adult females? Does it also extend to girls? Okay, in this context, does it apply to girls? If it turns out that all the tafsir agree, okay, if it turns out that the lexicons, the classical lexicons, they agree, if it turns out that that's just the reading that would be most natural in context given the logic of the passage, okay, then we go to this other thing where we're talking about Bukhari. We say, hey, it turns out that if we have multiple, for Bukhari and Muslim, we have multiple independent lines of transmission going through, and there's source transparency, so they're telling us who all their sources are. Okay, and we can retrace the steps. And then your criticisms of the reliability of the sources, they're contradicted by the historical evidence. Okay, then you can go with, I have a presupposition that this verse in the Quran means this, and I'm drawing a logical implication from that that doesn't follow, and that blocks me from accepting what the critical historians would accept as good evidence. And that's fine, but it's not going to be effective. It's not going to be dialectically effective for anyone who didn't start out agreeing with you.
Okay, so I did a search on ChatGPT with its limitations. What is the semantic range of the word nisa in Arabic? Does it apply to girls? Answer: the Arabic word nisa has a specific semantic range, and its use typically refers to adult females rather than children. However, its exact meaning can depend on the context in which it is used. Semantic range of nisa. General meaning: the word nisa is commonly understood as women in general, referring to adult females. It is a plural of imra'a, which means woman. Contextual usage. Nisa is used to denote adult females in a wide variety of contexts, such as social, legal, or familial matters. For example, the term is frequently used in the Quran, where it often refers to adult women with legal responsibilities, like in the matter of inheritance or marriage. Used in the Quran, for example, in Surah An-Nisa 4:1, the term Nisa refers to women in the context of their rights and responsibilities in terms of inheritance, marriage, and social context. Social justice, sorry. In this context, it clearly applies to adult females, not children. 4. Does Nisa apply to girls? While Nisa generally refers to adult females, it can sometimes include young girls in broader, more inclusive contexts, especially in legal or social discussions. However, this is rare, and is more likely in poetic or figurative contexts, such as the one I mentioned, for instance. This is me speaking, boy or girl used in that context, figurative context. Then it goes on to say, in legal terms, Nisa is usually understood to be adult females. If one wanted to refer to girls specifically, the Arabic term would be banat, which is a plural of bint, meaning girl. Difference between Nisa and banat. Nisa is generally used for adult women. Banat is used specifically for girls or young females. Summary: Nisa is primarily used to refer to adult women and is not typically used for girls. If one wants to refer to girls specifically, the word banat is used in sense. And it's very soft.
Look, I mean, I think we're circling at this point. So I think I'm going to be done after this one. It's been good talking with you. But, I mean, just what we've established, even by your own reading, even just the thing you just read to us, shows that it's within the semantic range for Nisa to include an underage girl. And that was what it said in the Lane's lexicon, which is that in the context where it's marital, it just means wives. That's what it said in the Lane's lexicon. You can go check the Lane's Arabic English lexicon. You can go check it. And it makes perfect sense contextually. That's how it's applied. Okay, and it's non-literal and it's generic and there's no age restriction on it. So just the fact is that if just for everyone to know, the Quran verse we're talking about is subdividing people into 3 categories. People who are menopausal, people who have not yet menstruated, and pregnant wives. So people who have not yet menstruated very naturally is going to apply to prepubescent girls. And it's only through this assumption that Nisa can't tolerate that reading that you would be led to the opposite conclusion. But I think we're just getting repetitive, so I think I'll rest my case there. If you want to last word, you can have it.
Well, I already read out the answer ChatGPT gave, and I think that's clear enough. If you want figurative or poetic context, you can use girls to refer to ladies, and you can use women to include girls. But in the majority of cases, most cases, it is referring to adult females, and that is how it is used in the
Looks like you outlasted him, Islam. Took the W. Hung in there.
Well, the final word means the word with weight, as I understand it. So when someone has the final word, it doesn't mean the literal last word. Who have never had the weighty argument shall prevail, but can I speak to Sasha now? Sasha? Yeah.
Good talk, guys.
Yeah, what's going on, guys? It's Sasha.
Zab, are you back? I mean, Sasha really did sort of do a bit of a beatdown on you yesterday. You did dodge like crazy. Are you back for more? Or it's not for punishment, my friend.
I did concede that as far as water being associated with life is concerned, there was somebody and some people who believed that water is central to life. But with regards to the verse, I think I mentioned, especially on Andrew making a statement that it's referring to the primordial soup. And I was wondering whether Sasha has any evidence that people believe that life originated from water as a in evolutionary terms. The primordial soup in the ancient days, in the ancient times. Just wondering
Why would you need that, though? Why would you need that?
Well, the verse says, and we created from water every living thing. Water is central to life, especially in evolution, including in evolutionary terms. So one could understand the verse as mentioning 2 things: one about the creation of the universe and the creation of life on Earth as well as elsewhere in the universe. So that is also relevant to what we were discussing.
But she gave you other examples, right? Her critique was, hey, there were other people before Muhammad that had similar claims about either, the water, but also that it's common knowledge about water and life, because it's just observation, and about the universe, right? So that, and then she asked you for a critique, and you sort of did everything except deal with it. You sort of went all over the show. You wanted to recapitulate the main point. You wanted to go back to the water thing. Look, I understand it again and didn't want to deal with the universe one where she gave you these other, references from other people's way before Muhammad's time that had talked about it. About the universe, the golden egg and everything springing forth from a void or whatever it was. I was listening to it. So I think she did a good job in saying that it's not surprising. You thought it was surprising, she thought it wasn't surprising. I think she showed that it wasn't surprising. If surprising is supposed to mean that it was something unique to the Quran that probably only God knew, clearly that wasn't the case. In either account of the water or the universe. I don't know what else you want to do. She's here. You're more than welcome to. If she wants to speak to you again, I don't know. But I think she did feel like you dodged a lot. I don't know if she's open or willing or available.
She did, you say?
Sasha,
Yeah, Sasha.
you gotta get her attention. You gotta go, hey, bitch! Wakes her up.
But meanwhile, I have a question I could ask. Based on like your views that you shared on Islam and so on, like I just wanted to ask, do you think it's possible for a black person to be racist?
Is that wrong?
You need to climb watch this right now.
Yeah, I don't know what Deepak's doing. I don't know if he's trying to be funny or what the point is of that.
He's trying to
I don't know if you want to answer that.
I would say it's possible. But usually racism is directed towards those with darker complexions. But race is not totally to do with color. So people can be racist towards other people as well of different nationalities, whatnot. So
Okay, that's the answer to that. So again, I don't know if Sasha's here, my friend, but what else do you want to say? Because you didn't have much to say yesterday, and you did sort of try to segue away from both of those points which he gave you. Other, accounts of similar stories about what's written live and about the early universe. What's Sasha? I don't know what else. Oh, there she is. Sasha, I don't know if you want to speak to Is Lamo again. He's been asking about you, asking for.
Okay. What do you want to talk about? The Stockholm probe?
no, it's okay. We had a discussion. Was it yesterday? So that's fine. You take care of yourself. It's getting a bit late here, so I might wander off. Just take care. That's all. Everybody.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Get eating till next time.
Until next time. Take care.
Cheers. I will give you props. Yesterday I spoke to Sasha, today I spoke to Ethan. He's certainly going for the high rollers, so to speak. So I didn't listen to the whole of Ethan, but I listened to a lot of it. Sounds like he's highly motivated. And I think he's more like a Christ. I think he said he was Ahmadiyya. And they've got a different take anyway. So he's just sort of outside of the mainstream by a long shot. I think that's why he hangs out with Mahdi and that lot as well, because they all interpret the Quran differently to the mainstream and the historical consensus and all the rest of it. Cool. Anybody else welcome to bring up whatever you want? Okay.
We could always talk about whether black people give me racism.
Alright, can somebody finish straight Deepak? Thank you.
Deepak, are you near any windows right now?
I will self-defenestrate.
Please, thank you. I don't need another 5 days of that content, please, for the love of God.
But just for posterity's sake, black people can't be racist.
Yeah, part of that was I didn't listen to much of it. That was pretty brutal, and Andrew took it on the chin.
was bravery.
You did miss it yesterday, that Viper. Sasha was speaking to that fella who's now on road in Marty's room. And of course, they go on much longer there, so she demonstrated a great deal of patience. And the guy sort of, because he brought up like a verse right about, Kitover on the crusade, which is not a bad one, to be fair, challenging with on the scientific miracles in the Quran, on all the prophecies, that sort of stuff. And so he brought up the verse about, hey, the earth and the heavens were one joined unit and was split asunder, and everything is made from water. And he thought that was like really surprising, and then Sasha gave counter examples, especially with the water one first, of other cultures that had talked about things similar, but also, I think she did, but certainly pointed out that it's going to be kind of something you can deduce the world around you. Like you can see everything that's living kind of requires water, that doesn't have it, it dies, right? You can put one and one together. So that's not particularly surprising. And then he didn't want to stay on that. Actually, he wanted to go to the, thinking that this closeness under business is like the early universe. And eventually, they went there. Then when Sasha brought up these counter examples from the Ayurveda, I think, and wherever else, that said, something relatively similar from a golden egg and spawned forth from, a black void or whatever it was. He didn't have much to say. He wanted to go back to the water one. Then, where the pressure was on a little bit, then he wanted to go back to recapitulate the original question. There was a fascinating exercise, maybe like psychological way of looking for a way to, just to take a rest break, so to speak. So yeah, it was a fascinating, entertaining engagement, I would say.
What Marty thought of his performance?
Yeah, Marty. You've got to get this. This was just lovely, right? Sasha didn't do it on purpose, but Marty came back. He was out of the room and he came back after a phone call. It must have kicked him off because he was on a phone call. So he comes back. Sasha speaking to his Lamo Pro, and Marty jumps in and says something as he typically does. He can't keep himself quiet, especially if he thinks it's an interpretation issue on the Quran. And so Sasha says something like, "Can you stop butting in?" And that particular sentence just hit him so hard. He repeated it about 3 or 4 times, about 5 minutes later, he still said it. It was like a real insult that she said, "Don't butt in." He really took offense to that. I was like, weird, isn't it? It's not like you're calling him anything or whatever. Hey, butting him. Okay, it's his room. And of course, he was butting him.
I can visualize him in my mind's eye repeating it at 30 miles per second. Angrily.
Martin, don't butt him. It was just like one of those things that caught him or, whatever, and he just like really didn't like that. And then he didn't want to allow Sasha to speak, and then eventually with sort of Andrew's pleading, he allowed Sasha to speak again for 12 minutes, literally he timed it. And when it got to 12 minutes, he's like, okay, now they've had a conversation, now other people are going to speak, right? So it was, that was just like one of those weird things that happened, unscripted stuff. Yeah, it was, at least this guy tried to, provide something, but, he did sort of end up scurrying away on multiple occasions.
Yeah.
But Andrew was very sort of amenable there. He was trying to keep the peace and trying to keep it going, etc. Because he's very much on a campaign about these Quranic miracles and stuff. So
I didn't know that was one of the things. That exercise.
So I think it's just something that he thinks is like easy to show that it's kind of really bad. And I said, yeah, they should try and convince you because you already think miracles are something that happens or has happened. Right? For us, we don't think it happens. So it's harder for us. The bar's going to be higher for us. You've already reached that bar. So they should try and convince you. Because apparently he had like a 3-hour conversation, but Cloud was saying that Andrew allowed other people to jump in and so it got diluted. And you've got to keep it focused on those people and not have other people jumping in, otherwise it just sort of goes all over the show. But apparently he got like it to not walk back, but to kind of do the Martin Bailey thing, right? First was, or maybe it wasn't walk back, depends how you characterize it, but essentially landing a strong plan and then
miracles, you know, it's like a big point within Islam that basically they're like, what further miracle do you need besides the Quran? Because everybody's suspicious because they're like, look, if you're really this prophet sent by God and these previous prophets were miracle workers, why can't you guys do miracles? And they're like, well, doesn't this suffice?
Yeah, and when you read them, Sergio, you're coming in and out. I don't know if you're there, but you can speak. I see you've sort of dropped off and come back, so I'm assuming that you're around. I don't know if you can speak.
Yeah.
There you are. Yes, so you're on the Quran Miracle / Prophecy Crusade at the moment, which is like kind of an interesting one, and it's very accessible to many people. Right, if you get into sort of deeper stuff, then you reach a lot of people. So I think it's kind of good from that point of view.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's been.
I don't know how much you listen to Ethan's thing. That went on quite a while.
Yeah.
I think that's some good points.
Yeah.
And I do think Islamophobe, because he's on the Mahdi camp, right? So they're all motivated, right? They have a particular interpretation that's very much like a modern thing. Like there's no slavery. It basically trying to point out a verse. This wasn't the Ethan, but separately that the Quran outlaws slavery. It doesn't according from my reading of it. And then that whole long discussion with Ethan as well. So he's very motivated about avoiding any of these sort of moral unpleasantries.
No, that was well done, Ethan. Good job, buddy. That was wild. I wasn't able to catch all of it.
And if you track his argument was he took this passage in the Quran and he says, because this passage in the Quran defines waiting periods for 3 categories of marriage, and according to him, it doesn't do it for anyone who's prepubescent, that therefore he can dismiss on the authority of the Quran and based on his religious presuppositions, he can dismiss all the historical evidence, however reliable, for Aisha's age. And then we go look at the verse. And the verse he points to that he rested his case upon, his opening argument, was a verse that very clearly, taken at face value, is defining a waiting period for marriages that happen before menstruation. And it's only through accepting his definition of this term that he himself admits contradicts all the commentators that lived at the time. It's only by accepting his definition that you can get the reading. And even if you accepted the reading, it would be completely irrelevant to the argument. But it's crazy that he was resting his whole case upon that. Then when we actually started talking about some of those historical sources, that's when he just starts grabbing everything in the garage and the kitchen sink and trying to throw it at Kupari's reliability. And it's just none of it stands up to scrutiny. And all of it is based off of him doing very biased prompts to ChatGPT.
Yeah, I heard a lot of that. But that's what, as you point out, Ethan, that's their presupposition they come with. Because they hang out with Nabi, who's got his own private interpretation of the entire Quran, which you can't find anywhere online, by the way. That his father and family members have got a copy of, and he's like with some obscure school of interpretation. Whenever you bring something to him, it's like it's the wrong interpretation. Virtually guaranteed. Any critique you bring, it's going to be the you put him.
Oh, sure.
Correctly. Yeah.
And it also goes, not to turn it around on Andrew here, but it goes to show you that you can't really get moral instruction from a book taken by itself, just relying on people to interpret it. Because basically, if you go by that standard where you make everybody their own pope, people will find whatever they want to find in the text. And so if you want to give people moral instruction, you can't let everybody be in charge of interpreting the text for themselves.
Well, that's how you get Matt Adams saying that the Bible condemns slavery because it says that thou shalt not steal.
Oh boy. Well, you certainly had Philo agreeing with what you were saying. He was liking it, well, at least insofar as that you were affirming Catholicism. He was like, yeah, Protestantism is satanic. I was like, oh boy.
I still think the best part is when he claimed that guy was senile and so that the hadith was unreliable.
complicated than that, because it was like, on the one hand, we had the information in a way that didn't go through that guy. But on the other hand, basically, we could show that that guy, the only criticism that was ever made of him was that his memory started to decline when he was old. And we know for sure that this passage didn't come from that period of time when his memory had declined. It was from the period of time when his memory was being praised. And so it was bizarre to level that criticism against him as a justification for dismissing this hadith. And the other thing that was crazy is just that why does he think that people place the Bukhari above the Quran itself? What is it that convinces people to do that, even if he theologically has reasons to disagree with that? It's because Bukhari was a really, really competent hadith critic. And if this guy knows about this criticism, of course Bukhari did. He wasn't going to rest his inclusion of the hadith on the guy's late period in Iraq. He wasn't going to rest inclusion on that. Just knowing Bukhari, he's the pinnacle of the hadith criticism in their tradition. And the reason why people would raise criticisms like this was that editors of collections like Bukhari would be able to take it into account. And so it's just, on so many different levels, it couldn't possibly be true that this guy just confabulated it in his old age.
Given all that, it didn't even matter, because even if he would agree that was true, he was still going to say it doesn't agree with the Quran, so therefore it doesn't matter.
Based on a preposterous interpretation of the Quran. So it just is it's so impossible to reason with somebody who is their own